Good evening. Pull a blanket tight, turn the lights down low, and let the long, cold hush of the north settle over you. Tonight we cross the thin line where maps end and stories begin, the ragged, luminous edge of Alaska, a place that keeps secrets the way ice keeps its dead, perfectly, patiently, without asking for forgiveness. This hour I will take you deep into 10 true accounts, testimonies from dispatchers, pilots, researchers, seasonal workers, and photographers, each pulled from the last frontier's remote reaches. These are not the usual campfire embellishments. These are recorded transmissions, coroner reports, field journals, and confessions whispered into night shift radios. Some were written in trembling notebooks. Others were logged on duty records and filed away. All of them share one thing in common: they happened where human help comes slow, where darkness lasts longer than you expect, and where cold preserves more than flesh. The stories that follow are crafted to keep you listening, to build curiosity, then withhold answers just long enough to make your imagination do the work. I'll trade calm for tension, comfort for dread, and, every few minutes, drop a cliffhanger to pull you forward. Expect unease, not gore, psychological dread, not shock for the sake of shock. Let the Arctic wind breathe cold into the hollow places of the mind. Lean in. We begin. Story 1, the call from beyond the line. It was February, the kind of winter night that makes the world forget it ever knew warmth. Temperatures had been below -30 for weeks. Roads were silent, and the kind of people who still drove at midnight did so with a purpose or a grief. Marcus had been an Alaska State Troopers dispatcher for over 15 years, the voice steady behind emergencies, the calm during car crashes, overdoses, the kind of daily miseries that accumulate until they look like the weather, inevitable. At 2:47 a.m. that night, his console lit with a call from a number that, on paper, no longer existed. The call quality was impossibly clear given the location described, the sort of clarity you expect from someone sitting in the next room, not from a cabin lying alone on a mining road 10 miles off a highway. "My name is Dmitry Volov," the caller said. "I'm calling to report my own death." It sounds like a prank at first, an absurd statement to test reaction time. Marcus held the line anyway. The caller's voice was flat, precise, a Russian accent soft enough to make his words slow. The kind of voice that has been through too many winters to waste emotion now. "I died 3 days ago," Dmitry told him. "Behind the cabin. The ravens have started. Someone must come before the wolves eat what's left." The dispatcher did the protocol, asked for location, relayed the welfare check already filed by a concerned neighbor, cross-checked the name. Dmitry Volov, 73, lived alone. There was a welfare check recorded 2 days prior for lack of smoke from the chimney. Units were dispatched. The patrol radioed that they had reached mile marker 47 and turned onto the old mining road. The atmosphere, the kind that paperwork cannot capture, thickened in Marcus's control room. For 37 minutes, he kept the line open, describing the officer's approach. Dmitry told him the exact spot of the body, the axe in the hand, the color of the snow around the head. Then the patrol reported a body behind the cabin. An elderly man. Cardiac event, frozen. No sign of foul play. The phone line remained connected for the full length of the call, Marcus's notes showing timestamps and details. And yet when he pushed for a confirmation, the voice in his earpiece went quiet. On the line, a breathing sound, not human, wet, ragged, as if someone or something was drawing air through collapsed tubes. Then nothing. The satellite provider swore the disconnected number could not have made the call. The line had been gone since the previous year when a tree fell. The coroner labeled it cardiac arrest and logged a time of death consistent with the scene. The paperwork closed. Marcus kept the printed notes. He transferred departments within the year. There are versions of this tale that sound like metaphor, isolation calling out its own end. But Marcus's notes are a record of a voice that told him, plainly and politely, to make sure his body was treated with respect. The last words Marcus ever recorded from Dmitri were, "I am sorry for the inconvenience." And then the line went dead. When the patrol's radio fell silent, Marcus heard something over the line that he still cannot explain. Later that night, his peripheral vision, he swore, caught movement by the radios, like a shadow rearranging itself. He brought this up at his exit interview. They smiled and recorded it as stress. But what if it was something else? Story 2, the photographs that saw what we can't. Isabella Martinez was obsessive in the way of artists who have chosen to live closer to the thing they photographed than to people. She loved winter because winter simplified everything, it removed color and left truth in stark lines. She photographed light as if it were a confession. In late 2021 she set out for an abandoned mining camp northeast of McCarthy to capture a phenomenon she called ice ghosts, crystalline formations that, in extreme cold, wrapped objects in frost so intricate they looked like figures. She left with a satellite communicator and a promise, message every evening at 8. The messages began as expected, then shifted. On day 4 she wrote, "They move when I don't look." By day 7 she wrote, "There are photos on my camera that I did not take. Timestamps while I slept." Someone, or something, was using her equipment. On day 10, the pilot who did an impossible flyover saw smoke from the cabin and gear scattered outside in the snow, but no sign of danger. The camera, however, told a different story. Isabella's camera had been taking time-lapse and motion-triggered photos. When rescuers finally reached the cabin on day 17, the camera had recorded hundreds of images, tall, thin figures like shards of ice standing around the cabin, peering through windows, leaning over equipment. In some frames they hovered inches from Isabella as she slept, in others, they appeared to touch the edges of her face. The images were crystalline and humanoid in their suggestion rather than their form, long proportions, limbs too thin, surfaces that refracted light rather than reflected it. Isabella was alive when they found her but catatonic, speckled with hypothermic anomalies inconsistent with her apparent survival. Her body temperature had dropped to levels doctors called incompatible with life, and yet she breathed, albeit slowly. When she finally spoke, she whispered, "They wanted images of themselves. I showed them to them." The hospital declared psychosis and exposure. Photographers and colleagues argued about light artifacts and sensor noise. But Isabella's camera continued to take photographs in sterile hospital rooms, empty corners filled with those same tall figures. Months later she disappeared. Her last stored images showed an apartment interior full of crystalline beings arranged like a family portrait, staring directly at the camera as if posing. Her equipment remained. We are left with the photographs, grainy, irrefutable in their own way. Some people think this is a psychological breakdown triggered by isolation. Others suspect a phenomenon we lack the instruments to measure. What unsettles me most is how often people who bring the right technology into the wrong place see things they insist were always there, as if the human eye is simply missing one part of an enormous ecosystem. In the weeks after Isabella vanished, colleagues began to notice a pattern. Photos she had taken of busy, ordinary places started showing the same tall figures moving like tourists through parking lots and grocery store aisles. In one image, a child sits at a coffee shop table while a crystalline silhouette waits beside the counter. The witnesses who saw Isabella before she disappeared swore she smiled as if reunited. We have her work. We have her silence. We have the photographs. What does that add up to? Story 3, the cannery where men stopped coming back. Fish processing canneries in Alaska are the engines of a seasonal economy. They bring in workers from across the world, young men with promise and older hands with grizzled resignation. The company that recruited Rashid Hassan advertised decent pay and housing. What it didn't advertise was the way time acts differently when your life is measured in overnight shifts, fluorescent light, and stench. Rashid was 24 and hungry. Fish Point Cannery was isolated, 40 miles by sea from the nearest town and reachable only by boat or helicopter. On arrival, Rashid noticed workers who never looked up from their trays, who ate like automatons, who carried the same brown-black stains on their clothes season after season. He saw a night shift table of men who never spoke. He signed an extra confidentiality agreement to work in processing Unit C for double pay. Unit C smelled like chemicals and the sterile room resembled a lab rather than a cannery. Workers in hazmat suits handled a clear solution that, when injected into salmon, gave the flesh an odd, translucent quality and made it resistant to decay. Some containers labeled several years old contained fish that looked untouched by time, and felt warm to the touch. The company's story: food technology, military contracts, preservation techniques. The darker story emerged slowly. Workers who handled the solution for years didn't age, didn't sleep as much, worked with mechanical precision. Eduardo, an older worker, confided that some men had started taking diluted doses of the compound. It keeps you healthy. It keeps you working. But you need more and more. Those who refused to participate discovered that withdrawal was not metaphorical. The compound produced a dependency that made leaving lethal, organs failing without constant doses. Rashid tried to run. He made the harbor only to be intercepted and escorted back. The men who had been there for years were not inhuman in a single moment of cruelty, they simply did not know how to be otherwise. The last note Rashid hid in his things read, in handwriting that gradually straightened into uniform slanting lines, "We are becoming something better than human." Preservation is just another word for immortality. Companies with experimental technology and the government that funds workforce solutions make communities and economies complicit in their own erasure. The official report calls Fish Point a success in preservation research. The men who do not call home anymore are recorded in payroll as active. The question to keep in your mind is this: when a solution prevents decay but changes the mind, does it preserve humanity or obliterate it? Years after Rashid signed on permanently, an anonymous investigator found containers labeled with dates back to 2017 and 2018. The government file redacted entire sections. Rashid is still listed on payroll. And sometimes, on the longest nights, fishermen talk about seeing lights moving in the cannery as if someone is working still, though the diesel engines are cold. Story 4. The pilot who vanished between radios. Kenji Nakamura was a pilot whose wings had become legend in the far north. He flew where maps stopped offering advice. He knew when a cloud mass was lying. On a clear March morning in 2023, he took a charter flight with 2 researchers bound for a volcanic study near Lake Clark. The route should have been routine. He reported in at times and the dispatcher, a man who knew him for 20 years, heard all the small technicalities of a trip doing what it should. Then, on the return leg, Kenji's voice began to fray. "I'm near a valley with trees that aren't on the map," he said over the radio. "Weird. They're arranged." Dispatch thought Kenji was joking. He wasn't. The plane's last position showed it skimming toward a low basin that had no charted topography of the approach he described. He radioed a strange request: "If you don't hear from me, tell my father I saw them. Tell him I saw the forest turning its head." The words were absurd, until the distress call in the following minutes changed the tenor: the engine sputtering, a brief but violent loss of instruments, and then radio silence. Search teams triangulated the beacon and found the plane crashed in a basin cut off by ridgelines. It was intact in an impossible way: no burn, minimal impact damage, instruments frozen in the middle of a reading. Kenji's body was not inside. Inside the aircraft they found a seatbelt looped as if someone had sat there recently and a cup of coffee half full and unspilled. His logbook had a single entry scrawled in the margin for the last flight: "They are arranging themselves." Pilots whisper about the way Alaska rearranges its own edges: sinkholes, subsidence, errant glaciers that shift landscape features. But Kenji's family swears he knew mountains like a lover's face. His last transmissions described a consciousness in the trees as deliberate as a watchful mind. Later, a forester and a couple of local subsistence hunters mentioned seeing straight lines of young saplings tilted like heads. One said he felt watched along his own trapline and found that his compass had lost north for a few degrees. Kenji's plane is still in a salvage yard, catalogued like an artifact of a mystery. He is not. People who search for him report feeling vertigo on the edge of the basin, like the earth is rereading its own history and writes different lines each time a human watches. Months after the crash, a field notebook was found beneath a rock in a shallow stream near the site. Its cover read only, "If they can move, what happens when they want to see?" The entry beneath it ended mid-sentence, "Don't look at them. If you look, they." Story 5, The Forest That Stole the View. A retired academic named Kwaim moved to a cabin to write, to taste the silence of a forested ridge without neighbors. He set up a notebook, stakes, string, and an obsession. He wanted to test whether trees, not metaphorically, but practically, moved. At first, the movement was subtle, a slight tilt, a change in branch orientation. But his entries tracked an unnerving pattern over months. Trees were orienting themselves toward his cabin, not randomly, but as if aligning for observation. Animals adjusted their routes in ways Kwaim documented as deliberate, like couriers reporting back what they had seen. He began to notice oddities at night, foxes that watched the windows for longer than curiosity would recommend, a silence that thickened when he stepped outside. The deeper his observation went, the more he felt the forest as a presence capable of reading intention. Birds perched in particular trees and then flew away in formations that indexed back to particular branches. One night he cut a small path to test whether the forest would close it. In the morning the path was narrower, flanked by saplings that leaned inward like a gathering of heads. Kwaim stopped writing to friends. He severed his satellite connection deliberately, reporting that the forest provided all the stimulation he required. In his last typed entries, an attempt to produce a final paper, he argued that the ecosystem was not only sentient, but communicative. It optimized viewing angles toward his cabin, it coordinated animals into patterns that functioned as information gathering. He claimed, with the clinical detachment of a scientist becoming religious, that human civilization was a transient interruption in a larger conversation the forest had been holding for millennia. When his landlord checked the cabin months later, they found it empty. Kwaim's notes were there, open to diagrams of triangle changes and a final sentence: "They have always known when we start to watch." The final page of Kwaim's notes contained a photograph, taken at night with a long exposure, of the cabin's windows lit from inside. The glass showed, faint and shimmering, dozens of pale shapes arranged outside. The photo's appended caption read, "We were expected." Story 6, The Lonely Town and the Whistle at Midnight. There are towns in Alaska so small winter reads like a different planet. One such place had a tradition, an old industrial whistle from a cannery that would sound at the hour of midnight during storms. It was supposed to be a signal for the night watch, a sound to remind people the plant still checked its perimeters. Then residents began hearing a whistle that no machine claimed. It came at 3 a.m. at first, a single tone far away. Then it would echo through the street and trail off as if crossing a ridge. Dogs woke and howled. People would poke their heads out to see nothing but empty road. Shop owners checked inventory and found doors secured. The police ran the recordings through filters and spectrograms. The frequency matched no known industrial whistle, and definitive markers suggested a human breath instrument. But no human claimed responsibility. A seasonal worker, a woman named Anya, reported seeing a figure near the plant at 3 a.m. each night for a week. He was an old man with a whistle and a cane who disappeared when approached and whose footprints in the snow were two sets of prints that merged into one. Townsfolk told stories: a whistleman who had kept the lights on during a past disaster, a man who saved people and then vanished. The mystery, like a smell in the gutters, lingered until a researcher compared old municipal logs and found a name they had overlooked: a maintenance man who had tended the plant's whistle and who had died alone in his house 20 years earlier in a snowstorm. His last recorded action on the night of his death was a walk toward the plant. The whistle continued. People installed cameras. The footage showed an empty coal mine, a street where the snow lay undisturbed, except a faint trace of condensation on an otherwise hopelessly frozen window at the exact instant the sound reached the mic. The town reached a consensus: the whistle was a memory. Or maybe it was a warning. Either way, sleep became a commodity until the town settled into the new normal, live memory as a third, semi-physical presence. One winter a visiting police cadet recorded the whistle on his own handheld device. Later, as he played it back in a diner with the device muted, the spectrogram displayed a pattern, not random, but an arrangement similar to Morse code. When they translated it, the tape read, "Do not sleep. Do not trust the dark." Story 7, the hunter who found a house with no door. A subsistence hunter, Tomas, was used to moving quietly through the brush, to reading the land like an old, scraggly book. In late fall, he came upon an outlying cabin he didn't recognize, a place with smoke from the chimney but no visible path leading to it. The cabin had one thing odd: its front door was gone, replaced by a tidy stack of firewood and a smooth threshold leading into the interior as if the door had melted into the walls. Inside there were items arranged as if waiting for company, a kettle warming, chairs at angles that suggested recent conversation. Yet no footprints led away and the windows were clear of breath. Tomas found a journal on the table with a single entry that described a man who had moved into the cabin and left notes for himself to remember to greet them. The final page contained a crude map pointing to 7 cairns that encircled the cabin like guardposts. The notes were written over again and again, as if someone had corrected themselves not for writing mistakes but for forgetting. Tomas left and returned with a deputy. They found nothing. No chimney smoke. No kettle. The cairns remained, and when the deputy circled them with a GPS they found the oddest result: every cairn's coordinates were accurate, but the distance between them measured shorter on paper than it was on the ground. The circumference they formed couldn't exist in Euclidean geometry. The deputy filed the report under oddities, and Tomas kept a photograph of the empty threshold folded in his wallet. That photograph eventually makes its way to a folklorist, who identifies a pattern in northern myth about thresholds without doors, thresholds designed for those who pass between visible worlds. The folklorist warns, don't ring those thresholds. Some doors do not open for the living. Story 8, the radio operator who heard his own future. A communications specialist working at a research station recorded a series of transmissions that began as routine checks and ended in incomprehensible arithmetic. He journaled details of remote sensors and noted a strange occurrence. Once a week, at 1:11 a.m., an amateur radio operator would call in and recite coordinates that lined up with no known sites. People joked until the day the transmissions included human names. The operator at the station traced one of the names to a man who would die 3 days later. Panic followed. They tracked more calls, and the coordinates always corresponded with small tragedies: a ruptured pipe, a collapsed snowbridge, a hypothermia fatality. Someone suggested that the voice came from a future radio of the world's own making, transmissions sent back for reasons we do not understand. The station sealed its logs and wrote heavily redacted reports. The operator, who had begun with a journalistic curiosity, wound up on every team from the coroner to the governor's emergency office. He left the job after the calls included his own name. The research into anomalous radio transmissions is a field with fewer fans than it deserves and fewer tools than it needs. To the people who heard those calls at the station, there was one simple, harrowing conclusion: sometimes information moves not only forward but backward, and when it carries names, you are forced to choose whether or not to believe. The operator's journal, smudged and folded, ends with an entry written in a different hand: if you hear your name at 1:11 a.m., do not answer. Do not say anything. If you must reply, say only, I am still here. Story 9, the camp that learned the sound of breath. Summer brings thousands to Alaska's roadless stretches for research, tourism, and resource extraction. At a meteorological outpost high on tundra, a seasonal crew reported nights when the world around their tents made a low, consistent sound. It began like distant machinery, a soft inhale that puffed into the aurora. At first they blamed generators. The generators were fine. The sound was external and came in waves, like wind folded in a human breath. One night a young research assistant woke to find that the sound corresponded to the tent lines tightening as if pressure outside had changed. The person at the tent flap saw nothing but their breath fogging up the nylon and then perceived movement, a gentle indentation traveling along the snow, like the body of something breathing under it. They cut the tent and found holes in the insulation that could not be explained by rodents or weather. The snow around the camp displayed shallow depressions in lines that resembled ribs. The crew packed their instruments and left the site early. Their boss argued with them, insisting that reports like these would compromise their funding. Nevertheless, each member filed private notes with phrases like, "It learned how to sound like us," and "It mimicked the cadence of human sleep." Years later one of the scientists, now an administrator, received an anonymous package containing a single-page photograph, a long exposure showing faint lines in the snow that converged like breath tubes toward the camp. Someone had written on the back, "Listen to what the land learns." Story 10, the last transmission. The final story is not the grandest, but perhaps the most intimate. A small rescue team responded to a distress beacon from a cabin within a canyon. The team recorded the interior and found the occupant alive but in a state described as detached, alert, awake, responsive, but distant, as if talking to someone behind the room. The rescue leader asked the person directly, "Who are you talking to?" The man smiled, and his answer is the kind that breaks through the veneer of rational explanation: "I am telling them our stories." They remember differently. They found photographs on the wall that had been hung upside down deliberately, like screens turned to show the back. The rescue team catalogued everything as evidence before leaving the man to his family. Later, the radio logs from that night showed the man making a last long transmission. It was not a call for help, it was a reading. He read through his childhood, his marriage, the list of names of people who had once warmed his hands. At the end of the list, his voice leveled and he closed with a line that haunted everyone who heard it: "Tell them I was here. Tell them to watch the windows." When the team analyzed the audio they discovered something else. Beneath the man's voice, in the same frequencies, there were faint, synchronous harmonics that did not match any known instrument, animal, or environment. The harmonics appeared to be repeating phrases at a different speed, words the human ear could not parse on the first pass, but that spectrographic slowing revealed as an echoing chorus of vowels. A linguist who later saw the file hypothesized they were phonemic impressions, like the skeleton of another language, one that existed in overlapping layers with ours. The last line of the man's message, transcribed, read, "We remember you when the snow keeps." When winter came, the local community found that the man's house had frost patterns on the inside of the windows, not the usual fractals, but long lines that converged toward the wall where photographs hung. The town stopped throwing the old photographs away. Why we listen? What do these stories share? Isolation. A geography that delays help and stretches time. Encounters where human technology, radios, cameras, refrigeration solutions, reveals things that the unaided human senses miss. The theme that keeps threading through each account is not a single idea but a pattern. When we bring our instruments to a place that has its own long memory, sometimes the instruments show us more than we bargained for. You might call these phenomena supernatural, or you might say they're ecological, the land adjusting, experimenting, behaving in ways we have not modeled yet. You might argue they are symptoms of a mind pushed too far by solitude. Each explanation asks you to choose where you want to put the burden of proof, on the person who saw it, on the instrument that recorded it, or on the place itself, indifferent and patient. There is another, quieter takeaway: human presence creates questions. We lay out history in maps, in logs, in payroll sheets, and sometimes those records fail to account for the quiet layers beneath. The North is patient. It does not rush its mysteries to judgment. It does not need our answers. A few practical threads: if you plan to go where these stories happen, take a few practical cautions from these accounts. Not because the wilderness is plotting against you, but because the wilderness does not forget, and lack of preparation compounds risk into true danger. Carry multiple fail-safes, a personal locator beacon, PLB, a satellite communicator with spare batteries, and knowledge of how to use them. Electronics are not magic, but they give you options when the world folds differently than the map shows. If you find unnatural arrangements, cairns in impossible geometry, photos in sequences you did not take, or persistent sounds that mimic human voices, do not try to solve them alone. Record what you can and report to local authorities who have experience with the area. Documentation helps future explorers and researchers. Remember that isolation changes perception. Hypothermia, dehydration, sleep deprivation. These are medical facts that change the way you interpret tones, shapes, and shadows. That said, never dismiss what you cannot explain as merely the mind. Sometimes the world does have its own replies. We gave life names, and we ask the places we visit to be reasonable. In Alaska, you learn quickly that the land keeps its own time, and its own stories. The voices over the radios meant to be mundane, a welfare check, a pilot's routine, a scientist's daily log, turned into messages that threaded us into the land's longer memory. The people who heard them were changed. Some left notes, some vanished, some became keepers of photographs that the rest of us looked at like evidence or relic. As you turn off this video tonight, keep one image in your mind, the photograph from Isabella's final set, framed like a family portrait. Tall crystalline figures fill a small, mundane bedroom. The camera has been set on timer. The frame has captured the world with clinical certainty. The people in the house are gone. The figures are in repose, looking directly at the lens, waiting for someone to notice. If you hear your name called in the dark, do not assume it is a mistake. Sometimes the frontier is simply speaking in a voice that belongs to another kind of memory, one that does not end when we leave. Thank you for listening. If you value these stories and want more recorded and retold with care, subscribe to Unbreakable Truth. Hit the bell so you won't miss the next whisper the wind brings. Share this video with someone who likes to sleep with the light on, you'll be doing them a favor. Until next time, keep your maps handy, your batteries fresh, and your eyes on the windows. Because sometimes what's outside is just waiting to be seen. End.